Aotearoa. Thank you so much for joining us for this CARE presentation on cultural Hindutva and Hinduphobia. This picks up on our earlier conversations on Hinduphobia and the ways in which it works as a communicative inversion. And what we will do specifically in this conversation is look at the ways in which the disinformation ecosystem of Hindutva works and use as a case study the targeted disinformation that has been spread by various Hindutva actors across the globe, and then more specifically here in Aotearoa, the disinformation that has been crafted and reproduced by the Hindu youth in responding to a white paper that had been put up by CARE on cultural Hindutva, and CARE's participation as a co-sponsor of the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference. So we will first look at the communicative strategies of Hindutva, and within that we will revise quickly the concept of communicative inversion. Then we will look at the case study of the Hindu youth response to the CARE white paper and the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, and then raise some questions with regard to social cohesion and democracy. I am delighted to have with me here today Mr. Balamohan Shingade, who has worked earlier as a researcher at CARE and who is also an artist. And Balamohan will be joining us in this conversation to really reflect upon some of the concepts that I will share today and examine the implications of that to questions of social cohesion and democracy. A couple of pointers before we proceed. Some of this content might be triggering, so I invite you to take a break from watching or pause watching if the content triggers you. And this content is copyrighted by CARE, so please do not reproduce or circulate it without permission. So, quick recap of key concepts. Cultural Hindutva is rooted in the political ideology of Hindutva that seeks to construct India as a Hindu nation, and that has been built upon the notion of a monolithic Hindu Sanskriti or culture. So cultural Hindutva in that sense is the cultural arm of political Hindutva, and it works to create the cultural basis that constructs India as a Hindu nation based upon the construction of a homogeneous, a monolithic Hindu jati or Hindu race. The communicative the infrastructure of cultural Hindutva, therefore, works both to put up a monolith while it simultaneously continually marks the other. Those are that are at the outside of this structure. Now, at the crux of cultural Hindutva in India is the othering of Muslims, built upon the production of the Muslim as the other, as the invader. And this then, as I have argued in my earlier work, is tied to the project of Islamophobia. It directly produces the fear and hatred of the Muslim by portraying the Muslim as the invader, as coming into the homogeneous, monolithic, pure space of India and rendering it impure. And this Islamophobic ideology is legitimized through hegemonic structures and institutions, all the way from legislative to the executive to the judiciary. And inherent in this process of othering is the construction of the Muslim as a security threat, as terrorists, and as inherently built in to be invaders. This then has served as the basis for the targeted violence that has been directed at Muslims. These forms of violence have often taken specific manifestations such as lynchings. They have taken forms of murder. They have taken much large-scale forms such as riots and pogroms that have been targeted toward Muslims. And alongside the forms of violence that result in murder and death, we also see sexual violence that has been targeted at Muslim communities and particularly Muslim women. Now, Hindutva works through a number of communicative strategies. At CARE, we have reviewed in our earlier presentations in the series concepts of othering, the ways in which the other is produced, concepts of erasure, the ways in which voices of Muslims are erased, communicative inversion, and then equivocation. Equivocation is the idea that a particular form of portrayal, while aligning behind hate, portrays itself to actually be distant from that hate. So while it attaches itself to the hate, it simultaneously appeals to narratives of peace, narratives of harmony, to construct itself as a peaceful form of organizing. The concept we will specifically focus on is the concept of communicative inversion. And once again, this is a brief recap of the concept. It basically works to turn materiality on its head. So it is an array of communicative strategies that take the materiality of events and invert them. Now, a wide array of symbolic resources are used to perform communicative inversion, all the way from storytelling, the use of texts, to use of images, symbol, and sounds. It is both discursive and material. So as a discursive resource, it is doing the work of turning materiality on its head, but then it is also producing material effects in terms of mobilizing violence that is often targeted at minorities, that is often targeted at oppressed communities, by framing them to be the danger, by framing them to be the threat. And it is thus an imaginative resource that is vital to the articulation of a nation and its culture as a monolith. So communicative inversion is integral to the project of cultural Hindutva. Now, Hinduphobia is a classic example of the way in which communicative inversion is mobilized by Hindutva, particularly since its political ascendancy in India since 2015, with the hegemonic structure of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, and particularly with the ways in which Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, has mobilized speech and forms of communicative constructions to project the Hindu in danger. So Hinduphobia then is simply this notion of fear of the Hindu and hatred toward the Hindu that is produced in order to hold up the infrastructure of Hindutva. I have argued in an earlier presentation that Hinduphobia is a key resource in the climate of hate in India and in the diaspora. And the narrative of Hinduphobia, and particularly that the Hindu is vulnerable, as in Hindi, the narrative is constructed around Hindu Khatre mein hai, the Hindu is in danger, has been organized to mobilize riots and pogroms that have targeted Muslims. It simultaneously undoes history to redo it under the narrative that this history is Hinduphobic, so we need to redo the history in order to assert the Hindutva. It articulates erasure as a communicative inversion, suggesting that the voices of majority Hindus have been erased under the colonial apparatus in order to then perpetuate erasure of Muslim voices, of voices of gender diverse communities, of voices of Dalits, of voices of Christians. And this then forms the digital infrastructure of hate. So if we map out the digital communication networks of hate around Hindutva, we see the ongoing production of Hinduphobia, of the hatred toward Hindu as a communicative intervention. It simultaneously interplays with white supremacy, particularly in logics of white supremacy, such as the Great Replacement theory, that portray white the race to be in danger of being erased and being replaced. And you see the parallels here in terms of construction of a narrative of vulnerability, a narrative of being under threat because of this architecture of phobia. So, Hinduphobia is a classic example of communicative inversion in the contemporary context of politics in India and in diaspora, because it works to silence voices of resistance to Hindutva, the political ideology of Hindutva that is based upon othering, that is based upon the production of the other to perpetuate Islamophobic hate and to carry out various forms of violence. It is deployed to attack forms of dissent, to imprison protesters, to attack academics, and to attack critiques in the diaspora. So, in the diaspora globally, then the narrative of Hinduphobia is drawn upon, and particularly as a communicative strategy to appeal to concepts of multiculturalism, then to silence critiques of Hindutva that are often made by minority Indians in the diaspora, that are often made by gender diverse Indians in the diaspora, that are often made by Indians in the diaspora that challenge the hate that is being propelled by Hindutva. So it thus becomes an organizing and mobilizing resource that enables the further perpetuation of Hindutva. Now, then, if you look at the narrative structure of Hinduphobia, and I've taken this example from this decolonizing Dharma conference or talk series that was organized here in the region, specifically out of Australia. And what you see when you look at the promotion of this event and the talks that have gone into the event is its performance of grievance. You know, that is a key element in this production of Hinduphobia, where it projects this hate toward Hindus, the notion of safety of Hindus, puts up notions of incidences of hate that are directed at Hindus in order to then hold up and create the space for Hindutva. In doing so, it then targets the critiques of Hindutva in the diaspora. And this point is really vital because as the political apparatus of Hindutva in India has started clamping down on academic voices, on activist voices, incarcerating activists and academics. The role of the diaspora has become particularly vital in being able to critique Hindutva. So this narrative of Hinduphobia then works as a powerful strategy in terms of seeking to silence critiques of Hindutva in the diaspora. It mobilizes the narrative of Western hegemony and co-opts the language of decolonization. So this is the form of pathology that you see in this Hindutva narrative, where the violence of Hindutva is turned into a production of erasure, into the articulation of marginalization, and then performed as decolonization. Of course, far removed from the struggles of India's Adivasi indigenous communities, far removed from the actual politics of retaining sovereignty over land and natural resources that are vital to Adivasi movements and their mobilization across India, and simultaneously claiming indigeneity for majority Hindu communities in order to then mark the Muslim as the other. So this form of communicative inversion as Hinduphobia mobilizes Hindutva in the global diaspora and more dangerously co-opts the language of social justice to uphold violent ideology based upon othering, and that is directly tied to the production of various forms of violence. So now let's look at the response of Hindu youth to a CARE white paper and the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference that took place last year and I would sort of map out the time frame of this attack in terms of the attack beginning in August 2021 and really picking up through the months of September, October, and November 2021. Now, Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference was a conference that brought together academics from across the globe and particularly academics from the Indian diaspora globally that felt the deep concern to come together to interrogate the politics of Hindutva, the ways in which it is setting up the infrastructure of hate, and to really then think through the ways in which educational registers can be built in order to bring about transformative openings. Also, along with this Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, CARE had been for a while based upon its work on mapping the communicative infrastructure of Hindutva, had been generating a number of white papers and policy briefs. And one particular white paper published by CARE focused on the concept of cultural Hindutva and Islamophobia that became the target of Hindutva attacks and then picked up by Hindu Youth. And again, just as a quick summary, Hindu Youth is an organization that presents itself as representing Hindu youth and is associated with Hindu Council. So let's look at the CARE white paper and its key arguments. The CARE white paper made the key argument that the project of cultural Hindutva, setting up cultural narratives and performances that hold up Hindutva as a political ideology, is inherently tied to Islamophobia in its production of the Muslim other. It then went into the case of looking at International Chinmaya Mission, pointing out that the founder of Swami Chinmayananda was also a key architect of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, or the VHP, that has been linked with violence and forms of terrorizing of Muslims, all the way from the mobilization of the Rath Yatra, the chariot procession that led to the destruction of the Babri Masjid and the ensuing violence around it, to the riots in Gujarat, to subsequent riots and pogroms that have been carried out. So the key argument in the white paper then is that we need to critically interrogate the ways in which these cultural processes of othering work to mobilize around forms of violence and legitimizing violence through the production of a cultural essence. So now that we have looked at the key arguments of the white paper, let's turn to what was happening in the months of August, September, October 2021. Around the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, the Hindutva ecosystem, and you can see the ecosystem flow from India into the diaspora back to India. So there is a great deal of back and forth, started producing disinformation targeting the conference, as this disinformation was built around the narrative of Hinduphobia, which is that this conference is promoting the hatred and fear of the Hindu by talking about Hindutva. And what you can see in some of the examples that I have offered here is the ways in which then the Hindutva ecosystem is mobilizing around this communicative inversion of presenting the Hindu in danger. Hindu khatre mein hai, if you recall. Now, this also plays out in the Australia, New Zealand ecosystem, primarily emerging from the Australian context, with a number of accounts then reproducing this disinformation, framing this conference and the academics associated with this conference as Hinduphobic, as promoting hatred toward Hindus, and then suggesting, and this is a critical point to note, then suggesting that there are neo-colonial agendas, there are agendas of the Chinese and the Pakistani state that are funding this conference. So this is another key piece of disinformation that then is used to mobilize hate. By late August, early September, a number of the organizers, panelists presenting at the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference start getting threats all the way from trolls in digital spaces to threats of being killed. Now, this violence then also plays out in the ecosystem of disinformation and hate that's then started targeting CARE. Now, CARE was a co-sponsor of the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, and a talk that was organized in solidarity with the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference on the concept of Hindutva is what drew the attention of the Hindutva ecosystem into CARE. And as you can see in the Twitter threads here that started attacking CARE, one of the key points was the framing of that white paper on cultural Hindutva and Islamophobia as targeting Hindus and accusing them of hate crimes. So this particular piece of communicative inversion is built upon that argumentative slippage, which is taking a critique of Hindutva and turning it into a critique of Hinduism and by extension of all Hindus. There is also a discursive move here then made by Hindutva in terms of claiming itself to be the representation and the voice of Hindus and equating itself to Hindus. The disinformation ecosystem then, as you can see here, further picks up in terms of suggesting that this work and my research agenda is funded by China, that I am a Maoist, and then suggesting that there are other underlying interests that have led to the foundation of this work. You can also see the continuing portrayal of this work as dangerous. So the critique of Hindutva as dangerous to Hindus. We have already gone through how this ecosystem that then targets the work of CARE here in New Zealand is tied to the ecosystem emergent from Australia. And this is a key point for us to really think through in terms of the interpenetrating nature of these Hindutva ecosystems. For instance, at a later point, a petition was organized that emerged out of this Australian ecosystem and found its way into Aotearoa, New Zealand, including in communities in Aotearoa where that petition was being circulated based upon that disinformation. Now, I will then look at the response of the Hindu youth, and this was published as a press release in Indian Newslink that condemned the white paper as insightful and explosive, and walk through some of the key rhetorical moves that are made in that press release. So the first thing is, if you look at that narrative structure of the information that is put up by the Hindu youth, it replicates the communicative ecosystem of Hindutva in suggesting that a critique of Hindutva, which is what was reflected in the white paper, is a critique of Hinduism, which makes life dangerous for suggestively all Hindus here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. More importantly, you see the ways in which this infrastructure is set up. It first establishes its credibility by drawing upon political leaders that have participated in events that are held by Hindu youth and Hindu council. Moreover, in the structure of disinformation, the credibility is established through the articulation of the contribution of Hindus. So Hindus contribute to the wider community. Then there is an articulation of the various forms of contributions that are made, which then becomes the setting within which the communicative inversion is presented as, the critique of Hindutva as an attack on Hindus. So then let's look at this further, and I picked up this one paragraph, which is a series of sentences from that press release, and particularly draw your attention to this notion that the white paper made several accusatory and unsubstantiated assertions against Hindus, and in particular the Hindu community living in Aotearoa. So this is an example of the ways in which the communicative inversion works. And you see here how the critique of Hindutva is turned into assertions against Hindus, and it further then is extended into suggesting that these are accusations against the Hindu community living in Aotearoa. Further, the communicative inversion is propelled by suggesting that, the white paper indicates that Hindus are trained to commit vigilante violence against other communities, that New Zealand Hindus are brainwashed to becoming supremacists, that Hindu art and cultural elements promote Islamophobia, which are false narratives the publication attempts to paint as real. And this narrative itself is based upon that falsehood, that the critique of Hindutva is a critique of Hindus. So see the replacement here of the term Hindutva with Hindus, and which becomes the basis for the organizing of the campaign. This communicative inversion is further propelled by an attack on the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, and the press release goes on to suggest that it's a highly controversial and Hinduphobic conference, once again, labeling the conference Hinduphobic. And again, here you see how the Hindutva ecosystem emergent out of India is reproduced in this narrative here. So it's really critical to look at this flow, that there is actual interpenetrating connection between these narrative infrastructures, and suggesting that the conference is aimed at vilifying the global Hindu community. So this disinformation is seeded and circulated by Hindutva in various parts of the diaspora, by Hindutva ideologues in India, and then it gets picked up here in Aotearoa, and then suggesting that the conference has been ploy to scam people. Now, within this context, I want to read a letter that was written by Professor Gran Prakash, the historian, who was one of the organizers of the conference, to presidents, provosts, and professors who were supporting the conference. And here I will quote from Professor Prakash. And he says, to Two things made this conference extraordinary, I quote. The first was the urgency of the discussion and the need for these debates, which was felt by scholars from over 70 academic units across more than 50 universities around the world, including at your university. This urgency was reflected in the engagement the conference received. Nearly 7,000 people viewed the opening panel on YouTube. The 9 panels cumulatively accumulated over 30,000 views. Multiple online channels replicated the stream, some with our permission and some without. We anticipate that many more people will come to watch and learn from each of the sessions. It then goes on. The second extraordinary thing about the conference was the massive disinformation campaign by those seeking to prevent the academic scrutiny of Hindutva. The campaign launched against this conference was concerted, comprehensive, and entirely without scruples. As has been covered in The Guardian and Al Jazeera, and I might add here in Aotearoa by New Zealand Herald and staff, many participants received threats, including death threats. We know that as a co-sponsoring institution, you also faced overwhelming pressure to pull out from this conference. The threats included nearly every threat to academic freedom listed on AAUP, American Association of University Professors website. For the most part, these threats were ineffective. While some speakers did drop out under the relentless threats, others promptly stepped up to take their place. Even more heartening was the overwhelming support the conference received from over 1,000 academics, over 60 community organizations, as well as from key bodies like the Association of Asian Studies and PEN International, end quote. So juxtapose this disinformation in the context of the credibility and vitality of this conference, rooted in the expertise of academics truly concerned about the hate infrastructure propelled by Hindutva. Then Hindutva goes on to talk about how it is going to encourage organizations and students to avoid university. So the performance of the aggrieved student is a critical feature in threatening academic freedom. And here I read, Hindu youth took issue with the use of the word Hindu in research on political ideologies. Here I might point out the research points to Hindutva, not Hindu. Call it for what it is, right-wing Indian nationalism, said its president Murali Krishna Magasan, claiming the white paper could lead to physical attacks on Hindus, especially students. This is in a follow-up story done in the Herald. The last thing Hindu Youth New Zealand wants to be doing is trying to inform Hindus in New Zealand that Massey University endorses Hinduphobia and Hindumesia, and Hindu students should look to alternative institutions of higher education where they will not be marginalized and can feel safe. So again, please pay attention to the ways in which the narrative of victimhood, of grievance is performed here and is communicatively inverted to really attack academic freedom and silence critique of Hindutva. This then is the final communicative inversion I want you to pay attention to, is that as Hindu youth participates in this disinformation campaign threatening academic freedom, it projects itself as an advocate for academic freedom. So under the Hindu Youth's press release, under the subheading Advocates of Free Speech, here you have Hindus advocate free speech, academic freedom, and inquiring into the truth, as these are all fundamental values for the Hindu community. These expressions in the society are important as it allows for improvement, reform, objective critiquing, and ultimately contributing back to the community. So the layers of communicative inversion go from the performance of grievance to the mobilization of Hindus under the banner of Hindutva to suggest that Hindus are being targeted, and then to claim that, of course, Hindu youth, as Hindus everywhere, are supportive of free speech and academic freedom. So I want to draw some key conclusions for us to really think through. Organizations like Hindu Youth in Aotearoa operate on the basis of multicultural license. Now, what do I mean by multicultural license? They secure their license as organizations in Aotearoa under the narrative of diversity, under the narrative of multiculturalism. So we need to critically interrogate uh, the responsibility of these organizations in terms of their commitment to truth, accuracy, and democracy, and particularly in terms of their roles then in circulating disinformation and how those can be critically evaluated and looked at. I also note here that Hindu youth imposes the monolithic narrative of Hindu culture that is rooted in its ideology of Hindutva to erase spaces for plural voices, including voices of Hindus and diverse Hindu youths in the diaspora. I also want to point out the ways in which the information or the disinformation ecosystem of Hindu youth here in Aotearoa connects with the disinformation and hate ecosystem of Hindutva in Australia and in India, as well as in the global diaspora. So this demonstrates the ways in which disinformation flows. These, I believe, need to be looked at in terms of the ways in which they challenge social cohesion, particularly the ways in which a shallow, superficial approach to multiculturalism that lets such disinformation go unchecked under a narrative of cultural essence actually threatens fundamentally social cohesion and then challenges democracy. We have seen with the targeting of care the ways in which this targets academic freedom specifically. But then, what are the real issues in terms of overarching questions of democracy and democratic processes when such disinformation goes unchecked and is circulated widely? I will now invite you, Balamohan, to respond to this and offer your thoughts.
Kia ora, Professor Datta. Thank you so much for allowing me the privilege to respond to this presentation. I'm reminded through your presentation of what Professor Priyamwala Gopal once quipped. She said, "There needs to be a global conference on Hindutva and harassment. The response itself will provide case studies for the conference to discuss. Everyone wins." Now, I won't go into what the political ideology of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, is, and how it lays claims to the pluralistic religion of Hinduism, and how in Hindutva's adherence's efforts to construct a Hindu Rashtra, they quarry India's secular democratic foundations. I won't go into it because they've laid it out so brilliantly, and also because there's just so much literature on it already. I want to speak and I want to respond to your presentation from the experiences of someone who shares in this identity, in this cultural identity of Hindu youth in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but who's not part of this Hindu Youth New Zealand organization. You see, I was raised in India and in Aotearoa, New Zealand by temple-going parents. We as a family migrated to Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, as a family at the turn of the millennium. And much of my secondary and tertiary education has been in this city, in the disciplines of philosophy and fine arts. My acknowledgements also here to Mana Whenua, Ngāti Whatua. Here's the important point. There's the common experience for my cohort that of being a minority, and the attendant anxiety of deracination amongst our parents, and amongst us too, as youth, that is to be uprooted. And so, for many settlers, old and new migrants alike, the dislocation from cultural roots required, and in fact comprised, a constant negotiation of settler identity on the one hand, that is what it means to be a New Zealander, Tawiwi, and diasporic identity on the other hand, what it means to be Indian, and more specifically perhaps what it means to be a Muslim Indian or a Dalit Indian or a queer Indian, or as in my case perhaps a Hindu Indian with quite dissident theistic commitments. Anyway, it encompassed an ongoing search for an understanding of our cultural inheritances, especially to recover a sense of dignity based upon the identity of being an Indian in the backdrop of discrimination and racism which is actually experienced by many non-white peoples in settler colonial contexts. Now, this experience of discrimination based on racial identity is exploited by Hindutva groups. That is, those who appeal perversely to the idea of India as a Hindu Rashtra and who render particularly Muslims, Christians, and also LGBTQI communities as internal threats, foreign invaders, or otherwise deviant and undesirable. And this has huge consequences for cultural inheritance, cultural identity, which you point out so brilliantly in your presentation. And I think it's in these crevices, in the crevices of these kinds of vulnerabilities, that Hindutva groups offer noxious narratives to help prop up a sense of pride among the diaspora. And what's more, as we've seen from your presentation, the narratives include and are centered on disinformation, misinformation, and communicative inversions. There are several, factual errors and omissions that Hindutva organizations appeal to in order to kind of prop up the sense of pride. But the truth is, there are many streams of thought and tradition, and we can recall, for example, the Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb that's been so important for the promotion of Hindustani music or North Indian classical music, of which I'm an amateur practitioner. And we wouldn't have such a singer of Hindu devotional music as Pandit Bhimsen Joshi if it not were for his teacher's teacher, a Muslim musician, Ustad Abdul Karim Khan Sahib of Kirana Gharana. And who in his time experienced so many belligerent forces critiquing and criticizing his practicing of Hindustani music. But he lets the practice itself be the proof of pluralism. And as does Pandit Bhimsen Joshi, and as do many of the Hindustani classical musicians, a tradition that is secular and pluralistic in character. This is why I find the idea of communicative inversion so powerful, because I was returning to Pune for my fourth music residence in 2018 when another singer from the southern stream, T.M. Krishna, was targeted. Because you see, the Carnatic singer had been raising the hackles of Hindutva people with songs on Jesus in Malayalam, Allah in Tamil, verses by the 12th century philosopher Basavanna, and the 21st century author Perumal Murugan, and bhajans by anti-colonialist Gandhi and poet Sant Tukaram. He demonstrates how risky the business of pluralism is, because calls were made from above, and the Hindutva goons had gathered below, and all of them accused the Carnatic singer of polluting the sanctity of the classical tradition. And they bared their fangs with these familiar slogans which you showed in your presentation, the fangs of anti-nationalist, anti-Hindu. And for those of us students of music watching, the irony was not lost on us that the most Indian of art forms, Carnatic music, and that the most esteemed practitioner of such an art form threatened the legitimacy of their project, that is, the recreation of India as a Hindu Rashtra. And so, one other thing is that the intolerance of pluralism is not an India-only problem. This variety of it spills across India and its diaspora. That same year, in Maryland, United States, a Hindu temple cancelled T.M. Krishna's concert after coming under pressure from Hindu Americans who did not like that he sang Christian hymns. There are many other kinds of experiences that we could go into that demonstrate communicative inversion. For example, the targeting of our colleagues, myself included, that we were somehow a nefarious force working for the Pakistan ISI, the Secret Service. These sorts of bonkers theory are what the Hindu nationalists, Hindutva groups, rely on to legitimize their projects. And I think, I'm reminded that one day we will each of us have to answer our descendants what role we played in these history's tussles. When Hindustani music, for example, as a syncretic and secular tradition comes into conflict with conspiratorial constructions of Hindutva supporters, did we succumb or did we dissent? Did we remain uncritical when our tradition was being cornered into regressive cul-de-sacs? Or did we take it as a studied resource and sing with practical intent to enact our desires for a better present? I think we have a choice. We ought to reflect critically on the sources from which we draw our pride as Indian New Zealanders. Coming back to our key point here, or at least what I've been thinking through in my experience as a youth, as a cultural identity who shares in Hindu, because we ought to reflect critically all of this in the backdrop of conspiracies fanned by the followers of Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, and particularly Hindu Youth New Zealand, the organization. And I should like to ask, for example, what is gained from the Indian diaspora's association with Hindu Youth New Zealand and the Hindu Youth's campaigns? Seriously, what is gained? For example, for a climate change researcher in New Zealand who engages in ministerial dialogues, who is a prominent volunteer for Hindu Youth New Zealand and is the organization's representative in Religious Diversity Center. What is gained by the Sikh and Buddhist faith representatives in the participation of Hindutva projects, of Hindu Youth New Zealand's platforming of the ideology of Hindu Rashtra? Thank you, for the presentation and allowing me the chance to reflect with you on such a topic. And I want to end just these thoughts with an ideal by Sant Kabir. A short verse which I think exemplifies and offers pushback. And it also offers the sort of syncretic view of our Indian culture that offers a studied resource for me. He said, Koi jape Rahim Rahim, koi jape Hai Ram. Das Kabir hai prem pujari, donon ko pranam. Thank you so much, Mohanda. And thank you for the presentation that outlines so clearly what is at stake for us as youth in amongst these movements.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Balamohan, for that reflection. And what I find particularly powerful is the ways in which you attend to the pluralism of Hinduism. The diverse forms and traditions and faith practices of Hinduism, and the diverse forms and practices of other communities who are often disenfranchised and marginalized, the gender diverse communities, Dalit communities, Muslim communities from the Indian diaspora that are present here. And the question that you're raising really also makes one wonder about the role of the crown in terms of uh, how spaces can be sustained for difference and diversity and pluralism when active efforts are in place to erase these spaces on one hand, and also to co-opt these spaces on the other hand. I think that's a really vital question, because your articulation and the TM Krishna example is a powerful one, and what it demonstrates is the ways in which the communicative infrastructure of Hindutva is organized to silence on the basis of communicative inversion, but then deploying a variety of strategies such as systematic campaigns, which you have experienced, as have other care researchers when, working on this issue of Hindutva. And I suppose, the question within that context is, what is the role of the crown? Because you have asked, this question in terms of, the need for critical reflexivity, and for us to each interrogate, right? What are we participating in when we participate in a particular project? When we show up, for instance, as an instrumentalist or a vocalist or a dancer at a particular event that is performed under the Hindutva banner, for instance. What are the implications of that in terms of a politics of erasure? Am I participating in perpetuating that erasure, given what we see in terms of that infrastructure of disinformation? But coming back to the crown, then I suppose the question worth asking is, what is the responsibility of various ministries, such as the Ministry of Ethnic Communities, in engaging with these questions of erasure and difference? And then going back to the question of multicultural license that I was talking about earlier, how do we really hold communities accountable, or community organizations that project themselves to be representing a particular community accountable to a multicultural commitment, and of course in Aotearoa, a commitment to Tetiriti.
Absolutely. I think these are key questions in terms of how it has been that, at least through my sort of growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, observing how very uncritical multiculturalism has helped legitimize such a project as the Hindutva's projects in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and what the consequences might be insofar as our experiences on the ground of social cohesion. Um, and it there are, as you have drawn out so powerfully, key cultural elements that are at play, that are at stake as well. And so, um, what sorts of accountabilities might there be uh, in our uh, in our context of Aotearoa New Zealand for organizations, for the for the bidirectional flows between India and New Zealand, between Australia and New Zealand also, as you've outlined, and between the Hindutva organizations organized globally.
Mm. One of the communicative inversions that I thought was quite um, powerful while running this analysis is, this narrative that, of course, you can call um, um right-wing extremism elsewhere by what it is, um, uh, as if suggesting, there is a distance from that, but please don't, call it Hindu. While, nowhere in my work really do I refer to Hindus. And I take great pains, in fact, to talk about how Hindutva as a political ideology is distinct from Hinduism. But, that performances of distance is quite interesting, while actually, what I'm seeing in this analysis is that, in fact, um, the narratives are very much embedded within the Hindutva communicative ecosystem.
Very true. And I think there's also some sleight of hand going on here by the Hindu Youth New Zealand insofar as conflating Indian nationalism and Hindu nationalism as ideologies, which are so distinct. Um, and it only takes a sort of um, very brief look at India's modern history to know how these two ideologies, among many other ideologies, were very vigorously argued out and practiced out, and that they are not at all adjacent, let alone the same.
Yes. I want to wrap up by this one last point, which is, the point about credibility, right? And I want to throw up on the screen, when the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference was being attacked, and, suggesting that is a sham, with a sham set of organizations, and really for our audience, and Balamohan, I think this is a great point of conversation, which is that these are the contributing sponsors and co-sponsors to the conference. Northwestern, Princeton, Stockton, Stanford, UC Santa Cruz, UPenn, Ohio State, Harvard, Lehigh, McMaster, University of Washington at Seattle, Toronto, Mississauga, Simon Fraser at Cornell, and then CARE is on that list as a supporting co-sponsor. So I find this quite interesting in terms of the question of credibility that is raised by Hindu youth itself being a communicative inversion that really raises a number of questions about their credibility as an organization.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Datta, and for the opportunity and the privilege for me to be able to respond to it.
Thank you, Balamohan.